Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation where I'll attempt to queer Dracula's relatives. Now, especially in this classroom, we all know who Dracula is, but even outside of this classroom, I think everyone probably knows, because Dracula is an integral part of pop culture, and the spread of vampirism is associated with the spread of power and control over something, which is something that's talked about a lot, I think. So instead, I want you to think of Dracula as a sexual deviant. I want you to think of Dracula as someone defying heterosexuality and something that is inherently queer. And we'll look through a queer lens for that to see these points in Dracula. And for that, we will apply queer theory and try to deconstruct heteronormativity. And I'll read out my thesis to you, which will follow, and that is that if we apply queer theory to Dracula, it becomes apparent that Dracula, and I mean Dracula the novel as well as the character itself, defies heteronormative ideas, and with that, norms of Victorian times by portraying the vampire as the other or as the queer. And the structure for this is that we'll look at three aspects of defiance. First, defiance of gender, second, defiance of sex, and lastly, defiance of heterosexuality. And these are all deviant aspects that are queer or the other. And now let's come to the main part and to the biggest part of it, and that is firstly gender. I claim that Dracula, and I'm talking about Dracula the novel, defies gender expectations of Victorian times through vampirism. And we can see this in the beginning of the book when Jonathan is being seduced by the three vampiric sisters. And let me just present some textual evidence for this and read out two quotes. And those are: three young women, ladies by their dress and manner. And then the second quote is: I closed my eyes in a languorous ecstasy and waited with a beating heart. So what we can see here is that there are clearly three women, obviously, and those three women, following after these quotes, pounce on Jonathan because they want to bite him and drain him. And Jonathan, who is a man, is actually at their mercy and quite passive in his behavior. He's languorously waiting, he's completely at their mercy, he awaits his fate and is, well, quite passive. The women, on the other hand, they are pretty active. They defy the gender expectations of women at that time, that women are supposed to be passive because they're active. And on the other hand, Jonathan, who's a man and supposed to be active, is being passive. So here we have a defiance of gender. And further down in the book, we have another example where Lucy, a woman, stops caring for children, which would be her expected role as a woman, to be motherly and supportive of children and protective of children. And the quote for this is that there is a white figure which held something dark at its breast. And this is quite ambiguous because it could also be someone breastfeeding a child or simply holding the child and cuddling it. But Lucy actually feeds on the child in this scene. And that is a play on women as caretakers, because here it's turned around. She doesn't feed the child, but rather feeds on the child. So this all happens after Lucy is turned into a vampire. Only then she defies the gender expectations of a woman to take care of a child. And now, after having talked about gender, let's move on to the body, and let's move on to the character Dracula from the novel Dracula. Here, my second claim is that Dracula, the character, defies sex, and with that, he has to defy his body, because Dracula, being anatomically male but only able to give birth, is actually kind of the first support for this, because he's anatomically male but the only vampire to give birth. So that's quite a contradiction in itself already, but there are also hints in the text of Dracula being portrayed as quite androgynous, especially in relation to description of his mouth. So his mouth is being described as quite androgynous, or can be interpreted as such, because it coincides with both sexes. And let me read out the quote for this. It's that white sharp teeth behind the full lips of Dracula, and I think with the full lips we associate red, soft, voluptuous lips, and with the sharp teeth we see something aggressive, something dangerous, something penetrating, as he's a vampire. And that's actually already representing the defiance of his body, because he has this active part, the teeth that penetrate, but then the passive part, the mouth, the soft lips, the orifice that is penetrated. And speaking on giving birth, that's actually the second support for this, is that we can also see Dracula as an inverted mother figure. And for that, I have two quotes again. The first one is a quote of Dracula. He opened a vein in his breast, and then he seized my neck on the wound, so that I must either suffocate or swallow some of it, and then it cuts off, but obviously blood is meant. And what we have here is that Dracula feeds one of his future children by cutting open a vein in his breast to breastfeed them. And the defiance here is that Dracula, being anatomically male, cannot breastfeed, but he does it still with blood. He cuts open his breast and feeds someone with blood. So here we have an inverted mother figure, and clearly a defiance of sex and his body, because being anatomically male, he cannot actually breastfeed. And lastly, after having talked about gender and sex, let's move on to heterosexuality. And here my claim is that Dracula, the character, is actually defying heterosexuality by being portrayed as a homosexual at Victorian times. And first, we can look at his behavior, which has homoerotic undertones. So for this, I have another quote, because he is quite protective of Jonathan, and he's probably the one who wants to penetrate and seduce him. That's why he says, "That man belongs to me," in response to the vampiric sisters who pounce on Jonathan, because he sees Jonathan as his companion, since he's alone in this castle and doesn't really have anyone. So Jonathan is somewhat his partner. And Dracula being alone and sad with that actually coincides with the homosexual at Stoker's time. And let me quote Nikki Sullivan for this. She says, she's also an author on queer theory, she says that homosexuals were constructed as sad and twisted creatures whose perverse desires would lead inevitably to their tragic downfall and often their death. This coincides with Dracula in the sense that Dracula is alone in his castle, so he's a sad creature. Dracula, being the inverted mother figure, is Dracula as a twisted creature, and then Dracula being defeated in England due to his perverse desires of wanting to spread vampirism in England leads to his death and the defeat of Dracula by the other characters. So this whole Nikki Sullivan quote actually quite coincides with the whole story of Dracula. So that's why Dracula is being portrayed as a homosexual at Stoker's times. And now with the death of Dracula, we also come to the end of this presentation and to the conclusion. And that is that we can see a defiance of gender, defiance of sex, and defiance of heterosexuality. Those are three aspects of queer life, and they are actually fundamental aspects of queerness. And in the novel Dracula, all of these are deconstructed, and with that, heteronormativity is deconstructed. Thank you for listening.